Department to release its files on the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. But the Deputy Attorney General has already said the DOJ won't be releasing all those files by the end of the day, putting the Trump administration in conflict with the law President Trump signed 1 month ago. Joining us now is Neama Rahmani, a former federal prosecutor and someone we often turn to help break down these legal issues. Thank you so much for joining us, Neama.
Of course, Rebecca. Thanks for having me, as always.
So really want to start here by talking about what did you expect to happen today? Are you surprised by the announcement from the DOJ that they won't meet the deadline to release everything?
I'm not surprised because we've been hearing that the Epstein files will be released for months now. And even though the Epstein Files Transparency Act requires the release today, subject to redactions to protect the identity of victims of sex abuse, we really hadn't heard anything from the Department of Justice that led me to believe that they would be fully compliant today. So the fact that we're going to get some of the Epstein files, but not all of them, is not a surprise. Frankly, I'm surprised that we're getting anything at all.
So what happens from here as far as, do they get a slap on the wrist? Is there no consequences, so to speak?
Here's the problem. The Department of Justice enforces the nation's laws. So when the Department of Justice isn't following the law, there's not a whole lot Congress or the judiciary can do. This is the problem. Let's not forget, when it comes to the Epstein files, the DOJ could have released them on their own earlier this year when Pam Bondi, when Kash Patel, when President Donald Trump said they would release it. The privilege belongs to the DOJ. So they can waive that privilege and make the files public at any time, subject to, again, protecting the victims and grand jury materials, although the act makes those grand jury materials now public.
And from your experience as a federal prosecutor, what really goes into a decision like this to release files of this magnitude?
Well, typically files are not released, and there's a law enforcement privilege and an executive privilege and a deliberative process privilege that essentially says prosecution files, they're public. They're not subject to subpoenas or Freedom of Information Act requests. But of course, they're government files, so the government can choose to produce them and make them public. And those were promises that were made to the American people many, many months ago. Those promises have not been fulfilled. So now Congress is trying to compel the DOJ to do so. And frankly, and Todd Blanche is obviously very experienced, but he is running the largest law firm in the world, in the Department of Justice. There's no reason the DOJ shouldn't have been able to do these redactions and get these documents produced on time. When I was with the DOJ and now I'm in private practice, if there's a deadline, I have to meet that deadline. I can't just ignore it and decide to produce documents when I say they're ready. So it is really disappointing that the DOJ decided to not only meet this deadline, but at the 11th hour said we're only producing some of the files and you'll have to wait for the rest.
And as it relates to the files they are producing, how heavily redacted can we expect them to be?
It's tough to say. What the House Oversight Committee produced in the recent weeks, they were from Epstein's estate. They weren't from the Department of Justice, but they were heavily redacted. And again, I'm not saying they all weren't victims, but it seemed like anyone who was a female, their pictures seem to be redacted. So I don't know, the DOJ is going to take a similar approach. Again, the last thing the victims want and their lawyers and their families is to be outed. That's unjust and not fair. But I hope that the redaction is limited to just that narrow group of individuals who are victims and not everyone else.
And I'm curious if that was outlined at all, what can and can't be redacted, or is that just up to the DOJ in their own discretion?
Well, it's part of the act and it's also federal law. So there's two categories of information that generally are not subject to disclosure: identifying information for victims and grand jury materials. Now, the act, the way the judges have interpreted it, said that the act supersedes Rule 6, which makes grand jury materials private. So judges have made them public. They've unsealed them. So we're talking about materials related to the two Epstein prosecutions and Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, with respect to identifying information, again, the DOJ may take a very broad view of that or a narrow one. So until we get the files, it's going to be tough to say how much will be redacted. That's probably the biggest question I have, is what will be produced when will it be produced, and how much are we talking about in terms of redactions? Because really, the redactions, they're just supposed to protect the victims, not the perpetrators or anyone who happened to be friends with them.
And really going off of that, this has been a larger conversation for months now, the back and forth, whether they should or shouldn't be released. Is it likely that whatever ends up being released is actually going to reveal information that's going to satisfy those calling for this in the first place?
I don't think so. I think people are going to be unhappy with the redactions. I think people will be unhappy with the documents that are produced. Now, again, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm just skeptical. Let's not forget the DOJ issued a memo this summer saying there's nothing in the Epstein files that would warrant the prosecution of any third parties. Now, I know some other people are being investigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, folks like Bill Clinton, Larry Summers, Reid Hoffman, allegedly. Again, I don't know if there's any merit to any of these investigations or not, but I would be surprised if anything comes out of the release of the Epstein files. And this is why, regardless of what the files contain, a criminal prosecution can't be based on documents. It requires witness testimony. So unless a witness comes forward, a victim, and is willing to make an accusation and testify in court, the documents, they're more for the court of public opinion than evidence that will actually be admissible in a courtroom.
Neama, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your insight with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Rebecca. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.